CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to Global Africa Conversations, brought to you by the Wits Business School Center for African Philanthropy and Social Investment. The Global Africa Conversation bring to you global African leaders from different professions, different walks of life, different interests. We have selected feminist leaders, political leaders, entrepreneurs, and NGO leaders who are working on matters of Africa's economic transformation, women's political leadership. This program is normally run by Professor Becky Moyo, who's currently on business leave, and I am standing in for him, and hopefully you will find the replacement half as competent as the main presenter. My name is Brian Tamuka Kagoro, and here we mix humor with seriousness, but we keep it real. Jason Braganza.
Brian.
It's finally good to have you in a conversation about something and things that I know you care most about. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are at the G20 in South Africa, and there are fundamental conversations about development financing. And we are sitting at the Wits School of Business in the Center for African Philanthropy. And there are three things that have been ringing in my mind. We've been talking about African economic self-determination, self-reliance. Some people have been talking about debt sustainability, financial sustainability, and etc. We're going to get into that. But who is Jason?
Well, first of all, thank you for cornering me here in Johannesburg during this very busy week. It's a pleasure to be here, and really, as you say, a very important week, milestone for the continent, for the South Africa hosting having the presence of the G20, and having all these major leaders coming in, and also major thought leaders as well, to talk about these very important things. But who is Jason Braganza? Well, Jason Braganza is an avid and determined activist who sees Africa as a rule maker. Who sees that this is a very catalytic moment for the continent. He's an economist who is very passionate about the role of the state in the transformation of the continent. It's from Kenya, and I am extremely, extremely happy to be here, to be having this conversation with you.
Jason, what shaped your consciousness? Why didn't you, you're a good economist, why didn't you just become very good capitalist, make a lot of money, spend your time on the yacht?
I wish it was that easy. I dabbled into a few places, as most of us do when we're growing up and maturing politically in our minds. And at a very early point in my life, my professional life, I realized that the issue of development was so much out of the hands of developing countries, and particularly of the continent. And working for a development agency brought that very close to bear in realizing that development was just a way of trying to influence and infiltrate the continent and extract. And I think that was a trigger for me, having grown up in Kenya and had the opportunity to live in the UK. It really triggered me to see how international development cooperation was being used as a tool to continue exploiting and extracting. And I think that was the beginning of forming of my worldview of what international cooperation actually, from a Western philosophy point of view, looked like. And really seeing how African governments and the continent remained in this very subservient position. And that's why I said, for me, it's about Africa rule making. because, as we've heard throughout this week as well, we are net creditors to the world when we're not people who owe the world anything, but the other way around.
There are global structural constraints. There are continental level constraints, national and local level constraints. Walk us through this. What are, when you think about Africa's development financing, what are the 4 or 5 key challenges?
I think that's an age-old question and a very important one even this week, because the South African government, credit to it, has tried to put some of these things on the table. But more importantly, in the year of reparations, which is the theme for the African Union this year, if we take a trip down memory lane over 400-500 years ago, and you look at how the structure of global trade, global commerce, global industry at that time was evolving, and the role of the continent in that evolution, you realize from that onset that the design of the global system that we face today is that of extraction, and that as a provider of, or a source of raw materials. And at that time, 400 years ago, during the period of the transatlantic slave trade and so on, the primary source of production was labor. And then you move, from 400 years, 500 years ago, and you start moving towards modern day, and you continue to see how that extraction from labor to primary commodities to other types of raw materials that were being used to, finance, but also fuel the industrialization and transformation of economies in other parts of the world, while leaving the continent in this very derelict state. So, when you think about finance, when you think about transformation, industrial policy, we've got to go as far back as that. You cannot ignore that. And you can see where the financing challenges begin, because you've got this abrupt stop, if you like, to Africa's trajectory of development, of transformation, and being this source now of extraction. I think in modern day, when you look at things like international trade, development finance, they continue to follow this trend. And the West in particular, but now more recently, the East and the Middle East are big actors in continuing this extraction and exploitation of the continent, and continuing to indebt the region and the continent. And we've just not yet found that moment where we can just put a brake on that trajectory of exploitation. So those are the kind of constraints we're seeing globally. I think continentally, what we've not witnessed since the first wave of post-independence Africa is a continuation of that self-determination, that continuation where the second liberation, for democracy and general public participation in economic development, that hasn't provided the dividend that many expected. And actually what we've seen is a regression and a coiling up towards former colonial powers, or cozying up to new development partners at the expense of the transformation of the continent. And so in that sense also, at the continental level, politically and ideologically, we seem to have lost that Pan-Africanism that the founding mothers and fathers of the continent during the first liberation had. And that has resulted directly, in how the financing landscape looks for the continent. Of course, we've got the more proverbial things like governance, corruption, those are the usual things. But I think at a more fundamental level, the ideological underpinning of what development finance looks like for the continent has really not taken off as it did during the early days.
So some argue, Jason, that the second liberation phase, it's pro-democracy, civil society, delegitimized politics by focusing purely on the things, though important, anti-corruption, accountability, and transferred analysis to this notion that the problem is domestic, it's local, it's your people, and took attention away from significant portions of the intelligentsia attention away from the international system.
Yes.
The system that you described that had this division of labor. Africa as a net exporter of raw materials and net importer of finished products.
Yes.
Yeah. So what's your sense? Did and does some of the civil society activism consciously and unconsciously delegitimize politics? This understanding of structural issues as
Yeah, absolutely. I think so, and I think it's a very good question to pose to civil society, to activists. Just to use Kenya, where I come from, as an example. Last year we had this huge youth protests dubbed Maandamano over the proposed tax proposals in the finance bill, and a lot of people criticized civil society for not being in the front lines of those protests, and accused civil society of being in cahoots with the government, with politicians, by taking this very soft approach and not condemning the kind of actions that the government was taking against the citizens in introducing these very repressive and regressive taxes. And you're right, the distraction with not trying to figure out political ideology, philosophical underpinnings for what development transformation needs to look like, but also how does that on the continent fit within the international context, has been completely ignored. And we've been chasing our tails as civil society. We've also been not only delegitimized in terms of paying attention to the international system and the nuances that are moving, but we've also been caught up in this rat race of funding, this corporatization of civil society, where you pay more attention to doing log frames than you do being out there on the streets, advocating and activating for real structural changes. So there is this huge tension with how the second liberation is viewed, in terms of how civil society is viewed during this second liberation that we've experienced as a continent.
So others argue that the African state, post the colonial moment, became the new terror. That in the period of chattel enslavement, was this foreign entrepreneurs or foreign, and the period of apartheid and colonialism, it was this white minority dominated or European, Euro-American dominated state. And then post-independence, you have our own people take over government, but they adopt the same state apparatus previously used to oppress them, the same primitive accumulation previously used to accumulate in order to send off to Europe. They are not Europeans, but they were banking in tax havens and now in the Middle East. What's your sense? Is the African state a site of struggle, and if so, what struggle?
I think there are two or three things I'd say to this. I think the first one is we really need to interrogate the level of independence, from colonial structure that we actually have. As you rightly say, we inherited and adopted, and in fact, in some cases, have even made these things more efficient for extraction. Because they've completely sipped in through every part of society. There are certain countries where you'd be very surprised at the level of primitive thinking around accumulation, around how people are appointed into positions of power. So I think we really need to think through what that actually means as a site of struggle, as you've mentioned, because it's a mindset. In addition to inheriting and adopting these colonial structures of governance, we've also forgotten the intellectual capacity that we have, and we're inheriting a lot of foreign types of education. We're eradicating and crossing out a lot of our own history, and cancelling a lot of the historical injustices. I mean, you can look in several syllabuses across the continent. There are historical injustices or even historical successes of pre-colonial Africa where they're not in syllabuses. You'll not find them in books. The idea of alternative economic models of development, the role of the development state. In many universities, this is not taught.
Yeah.
You're all taught about post-neoliberal economics and how to privatize everything under the sun, So I think that's also an important part and site of struggle when we talk about the political apparatus, because your leaders come from these institutions who are brainwashed, who are conditioned to think in a particular way, and what they do is continue to reinforce and perpetuate these areas. So not only should we think about the governance structure, but the intellectual, academic structure is very, very important as well.
So Jason, many problems.
Too many.
But this week we've been hearing people like yourself saying, America is not coming to save us, Europe is not coming to save us, China is not coming to save us, the Middle East is not coming to save us. We must do this ourselves. Yeah. So what are activists and experts like yourself proposing as solutions to Africa's development financing?
Well, allow me to plug in Afrodad's tagline here, African Forum for Network and Development. Came up with this tagline called Africa Rule Maker, not Rule Taker. And I think that's the overarching message in terms of what the solutions need to be. They have to be geared toward us making the rules, not taking them. And on debt specifically, there's been some really good, powerful progress. And I must commend here the African Union Commission. They've managed just this year to turn around what had been a very difficult discussion on debt to actually have and host their first ever Pan-African Conference on Debt, which has given us a declaration and subsequently a common African position on debt. Yeah. And I think this is significant and a game changer in how, AU member states and the Commission itself can engage with creditors on debt issues. The second thing I do think is putting reparations on the agenda. I think this is going to be a huge political sign of struggle, but also a source of many solutions in how we articulate things around debt, illicit financial flows, human rights abuses, the return of artifacts and stolen assets and things like that. So I think advancing the conversation on reparations is going to be extremely important. I think lastly, broadly on finance, we do need to fully rethink the development finance architecture for Africa. I think the establishment of the African financial institutions, the removing, and I mentioned this last evening at a different event, that we need to move the power away from the Bretton Woods institutions. These are not development institutions. These are institutions that are established to perpetuate and promulgate the subjugation of the continent. I think the evidence is very clear, 80 years of that, and we don't see any of that. It's enough. We need to move it to a more democratic space. I think the United Nations, with all its imperfections, is still a place where Africa can make rules. We've seen this with the negotiations on the UN Framework Convention on International Tax. So, I think there is opportunities there, and that's being led by the continent. I think at the national level, we need to continue the momentum of what young people are doing in Kenya, Madagascar, Tanzania, Nigeria. They are here in South Africa as well. I think it's been immense to watch how powerful, public mobilization at this moment in time is. I think young people are beginning to finally understand that the demographic dividend is not going to be achieved if we carry on with this sort of state of affairs. So I think in terms of solutions, we need to find the third liberation, but with young people. Yeah. And just tell them that, and let them continue expressing themselves, in the way they have been doing, but with the tools that can put them into those positions that can progress the continent as well.
Somebody said to me the other day, it's amazing what these young people are doing. The difference, and he says, well, it's not altogether new. At the point of colonial occupation, it was young people who resisted colonial occupation. And going back to enslavement, young people resisted enslavement. During apartheid, young people like Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela and others before him resisted colonization and apartheid. He says the difference is, and this is the person saying, what spaces and places exist to form the political consciousness and ideological awareness of the young movements. So just thinking about that, you have this mass of outraged young people, brave to a fault, and standing up even in the face of death. How do you convert this outrage into transformative power that can deal with these questions of recolonization or scramble for Africa, whilst at the same time addressing the national accountability issues?
I mean, look at, I think we're in the age of technology, and the youth here have an abundance of creativity on how to mobilize using technology. I mean, just to cite two examples, what happened in, well, three, in Tanzania recently, but Madagascar and Kenya. You know, these were not things that were being done, you know, through churches or schools or universities. These were things that were being done through social media, through social interaction applications on mobile phones and things like that. And I think the next wave, that has started is, you know, the revolution really is going to be on using, on technology. That's where the mobilization is going to be done. I mean, in Kenya during the Maandamano, most of it was organized through social media gathering apps, you know, and people just didn't know where these young people were going to turn up from. But, you know, in the same way, I think that is the avenue. What we, I should say, we the quote unquote seniors who've been around a while, you know, it's how do we get that radical philosophical underpinning that fires up these groups that are talking, you know, and the ideological underpinnings that this is what the revolution looks like, this is what the struggle needs to look like, this is what the foremothers and forefathers that fought for independence, this is the vision for Africa that they had, and share that information in a way that young people now consume information. You know, they don't want to print 100-page documents. They want to see something summarized using the equivalent of a chat GPT that tells them, these are the highlights. You know, these are the key things, run with it, you know, and let them make up their minds if that is what they want. I think that is what we need to be focusing on. That is how we need to really fundamentally give them those foundations, is using technology and using that as the platform for you know, progressive thoughts and revolutionary thoughts that continue the struggle both on the streets and in different places. Yeah.
So Jason, this week there's been a whole lot of talk about cost of capital. Just for those who don't work in the space, what is that conversation about?
Cost of capital, in very simple terms, is, you know, how much it takes or costs a government or a business to access finance. Finance is a form of input into production for a country. It's also, you know, it's called capital because it's part of the economic system that's used in production. The cost of governments, African governments in particular, to access capital, and here it's specifically financial capital from outside of its borders, so from the international setting, so international financial institutions or international markets, is extraordinarily high. Some of the estimates coming out from the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, and the, you know, and other institutions, is that it costs an African government on average 4 times the amount to borrow from the international system than it does for a similar country from another part of the world. It costs Europe, I think, you know, the equivalent of less than 1% to borrow from international capital markets. But you're looking at African countries that are borrowing on average between 10 to 12, 13%. So the cost of capital debate or discussion that's taking place this week here in South Africa is about how do we bring that down? And one of the things we've been arguing as activists, as academics, as think tanks is, you know, the way the international system measures or ranks African countries is biased, is inherently biased. There's a methodology that's not, that puts a premium on certain things that aren't true or applied in other parts of the world.
That makes then Africa sound and look riskier.
Yes,
And
exactly.
then you then argue it's too risky to invest in the DRC.
Yeah. But they still come.
Yes. And then DRC wants to borrow money, so they must borrow at a premium.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding that you, the lender, are also the primary beneficiary from the natural resources.
Yeah.
Jason, let's locate. We located young people.
Yeah.
Who are really the new energy that's driving this transformation. African women have consistently been the bedrock of the 5 transformations we have seen over the last 50 years. When no one else could stand, they formed the Pan-African Women's Organization, POWER, way before there was any other Pan-African organization. Here in South Africa, when the men were complying with these Dompas laws, the women in South Africa protested against the pass laws. Hence the slogan, Watinti Mbogoto, Watinti Mfazi, Watinti Mbogoto. Market women in Nigeria, same thing, led the revolution, the protest against this oppression. Then in the 1980s, women were still struggling to be regarded at law as equals with their husbands because they couldn't inherit. There were many restraints on their ability to own property. Yet they were producing more than 80% of the food that we ate on the continent. Then women came again in the pro-democracy movement, whether it's Wangari Maathai or some of the women who stood up, I forgot, during the anti-apartheid moment. In that decade, when there didn't seem to be much from political parties, women like Albertina Sisulu, Winnie Madikizela Mandela stood up, Miriam Makeba. They became the voice against apartheid in international spaces. We're seeing when we're at the moment of privatization, women stood up to defend land, to defend sovereignty, to defend the things that matter. In the moment of HIV and AIDS and other pandemics, women came up as the caregivers. They bailed out the hollowed out African state. Right? They teach the workers, they subsidized it. We're in a moment we're talking about a potential boom from critical minerals. Yet when we reflect back, and I'm really asking you to help us reflect here, what are we missing? You look at African technology and women's leadership, figures very small. You look at African finance and fintech, amazing contributions by women, but at the leadership level, figures very slow. Improvements in women's political leadership, but if you look at women generally across the economy, on stock exchange listed companies and other, the equity value remains low. So now when we're talking about critical minerals, which has energized this conference in just energy transition, green industrialization, what needs to be done to make sure that we don't end up with the liberation that comes riding on the backs of women and the outcomes of which is continued feminization of poverty? What should be done?
I think first and foremost, I want to pick up on the phrase that's used on just. We need to understand what just means on this continent. And I think the way you have articulated the insensitivity and the lack of appreciation and acknowledgement of the women's movements in our liberation, that needs to stop when we're talking and needs to be rethought, redefined, but most importantly, integrated into this idea of what a just transition is. I think once we do that and once we have a very clear understanding that a just transition does not mean there's some sort of equal balance at a macro level, but there's some sort of equity at a micro level and at a citizen level, where the contributions by both men and women, but in particular women, are acknowledged in very equal ways, if not more. Then only then can we talk about a just transition. And I think that is very important as a starting point. I think the second one is we need to interrogate this issue of finance, the issue of political representation, and why it continues, because these two things go together. You know, we've seen in the case of Kenya and other countries, when women are trying to get into positions of power or positions of high political authority, the biggest thing that blocks them is finance. You know, and we need to find a way of breaking through that. But certainly, you know, acknowledging the role that women play in our liberation, we cannot expect to have the next liberation movement or the next wave of critical of minerals or scramble for the continent without having women at the center to continue being the vanguard. To protect for us from that level of exploitation. And that role needs to be centralized if we're going to talk about a just transition.
So Jason, is there hope for Africa?
Plenty of hope, Brian. Number one, our debt stock is 1.3, 1.4 trillion. The 55 African countries just need to come together and say, comrades, we're not paying. The world will listen.
We don't owe.
We don't owe. We won't pay. They will listen. You know, there are many academics who, or even financiers, who say that, you know, if you and I went to a bank and told them we can't pay their $100, we're the ones with the problem, because they'll come and take our things. But if 55 African countries went and told people, we're not giving you our 1.4 trillion, they will come to the table and tell us, please calm down. We don't need to act so irrationally.
Yeah, let's talk.
We need to stand up. We need to stand up. I think on the critical minerals, it's very clear that there's a scramble for this continent yet again, and our leaders really need to take shape. You know, there are beacons of hope with the reform of the architecture, the global finance and trade architecture, with the UN process on tax, the proposals to have a similar UN process on debt, so that we sort of remove the power from the Bretton Woods institution. So there are beacons of hope. The African Union Commission is doing a splendid job in trying to bring us together. And AU member states need to support the African Union Commission. This is a very important juncture in our history. Pay up their subs so that we can go to the negotiating table and say we're not paying because we don't owe. And that's it, yeah.
We're sitting in a business school, in a think tank.
Yes.
What role for African academics, researchers, thought leaders?
Find ways to delegitimize foreign capital and find ways to promote in-house on the continent. Some people don't like to hear this example, but Dangote, how many decades has it taken him to get where he is today?
Even with the resistance.
Even with his resistance till now, you know. There have been lots of captains of industry emerging from this continent, but where our governments, our leaders who perpetuate these colonial structures are hell-bound in blocking them from advancing.
And they prefer the foreign.
And they prefer foreign because it gives them that, validation, I'm not sure. But I think, you know, in an institution like where we're at today, you know, those are the models we need to find out. We need to figure out how can we tap and encourage African capital, African entrepreneurship, African innovation, and keep it within the continent so that we don't hear on CNN that that there's Africans doing amazing things in the US or in Europe and things like that. They should be doing those amazing things here on the continent.
Finally, Jason, African philanthropy. If you were to say, these are the three things that African philanthropy should do or could do to make us reach this ideal, what would those be?
Young people, women, innovation.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow. Jason, thank you so much.
Brian, thank you very, very much for having me.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's often said that Africans don't know how to resolve their own problem. Although America did not come to the G20, and others also did not come, what this G20 space has afforded us to see showcased was African agenda amplified and linked with other Global South agenda. The global majority world, from Sevilla in Spain to Johannesburg, has been talking to each other. Friends, thank you for joining us for this afternoon's discussion. We will continue with the Global Africa Conversations tomorrow and the day after. Jason, we are eternally grateful that you were the first guest to join
I'm honored.
the Global Africa Conversation at G20.
Thank you very, very
And
much.
on behalf of Professor Begi Moyo signing off, yours truly, Tamuka Brian Kagoro.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Man. Take care, man.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.